Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sarah, and I'm part of the team here at Test Innovators. Today, we're going to talk about the digital SAT. This webinar is being recorded, and I will be sending out a copy of the recording to everyone who registered. Throughout the webinar, feel free to type questions in the Q&A, and if we have time at the end, I'll do my best to answer as many questions as possible. But if there are any that I don't get to, I'll be sure to follow up over email. To start, I'd like to share a little bit about what we do here at Test Innovators. We've helped hundreds of thousands of students prepare for entrance exams and get into the most selective schools. We also work with tutoring companies, educational consultants, schools, and nonprofits across the country. We have a test prep platform. We help students prepare for a variety of admissions tests, including the digital SAT. We also have tools to support educators so that they can keep track of their students' progress, assign homework, and more. And just a little bit about myself. I have a background in tutoring. Before joining Test Innovators, I tutored a variety of different subjects, including a lot of SAT and ACT. So without further ado, let's get started with the actual webinar. So today we're going to talk about the digital SAT. I'm going to start with a high-level overview of the test, and then I'll discuss computer adaptive testing and how that works on the digital SAT. We'll then go over some test day logistics. Then we'll look more closely at the test sections and the content covered. Finally, we'll discuss how to prepare and look at some good preparation timelines. Okay, so the SAT is going digital. That is why we're all here today, to learn more about these changes so that you all know what to expect on the new test. I know we have a good mix of people here today. We have some students, some parents, and some educators. This webinar is meant to speak to all of you, and I hope you all walk away feeling a little more comfortable with the new test. I wanted to highlight a few notable changes for you. So the digital SAT is shorter than the paper SAT. So it's 2 hours and 14 minutes versus 3 hours. It contains only 2 sections, reading and writing and math. The paper SAT had a reading section and a separate writing and language section, a no calculator section for the math, and a calculator section for the math. The new test is computer adaptive, so each of the 2 sections is divided into 2 modules, and your performance on Module 1 will determine the level of difficulty you see on Module 2. We'll go over that in more detail in a moment. The reading questions on the new digital SAT each have a short passage or pair of passage, so each question has its own short passage or pair of passages versus the old test. There were some longer passages of about 10 questions per passage. And on the math section on the new test, you can use your calculator for the entire math section. So there's no longer a no calculator permitted part of the math. So when are these changes happening? Now, international students are already taking the digital test. The last paper test offered outside of the USA was December 3rd, 2022. The first digital test was March 11th, 2023. So by now, we've had a couple of digital test dates abroad already. US students, that includes students in Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, are still taking the paper test through the fall. So the last paper test date for students in the USA is December 2nd, 2023. And the first digital test date is March 9th, 2024. I do want to note that the PSAT/National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test this October will be in the new digital format. So be aware if there are any rising juniors, so that's the class of 2025, who are planning on taking the PSAT and the SAT in the fall. The PSAT will be the digital version of the test, and the SAT will be the paper version of the test. So as you're thinking about which test to prepare for, when to take the test, that is something you should keep in mind. Okay, so a little more details on the format of the test now. It is 2 hours and 14 minutes long. There are 98 questions, so it's shorter than the paper SAT and it has fewer questions. There are two sections, as I've said. There's the reading and writing and the math. And as you can see in this infographic, each section is split into two modules. They're equal length and they have an equal number of questions. Between the two modules, you do get a break. The total score is still on the 400 to 1600 scale. You get, the total score, that's the sum of your two section scores. So you get a score for reading and writing from between 200 and 800 and a score for math that's between 200 and 800. So this is how this actually works. So on test day, you'll go in and you're going to start with reading and writing module 1. You'll have 32 minutes to answer 27 questions. Now you can move around module 1. So you have 27 questions. You can answer those questions in any order. You can skip questions. You can come back to questions. So you don't have to answer them, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 27. You can jump around. So if there's something you don't know and you want to come back to later, you can skip it and come back to it later. During those 32 minutes, you can answer those 27 questions in any order. You cannot, however, move ahead to module 2. You're in module 1 for those 32 minutes. When your 32 minutes are up, you're going to move directly into module 2. And then it's the same drill. You'll have 32 minutes to answer the next 27 questions. During those 32 minutes, you can answer those 27 questions in any order. So you can skip questions, come back to them, but you cannot go back to module 1, nor can you move on to the next module. So you're in module 2 for those 32 minutes, but you can do the questions in any order. You then have a 10-minute break, and then you move on to the math section, and it's the same drill. So in module 1, you have 35 minutes to answer 22 questions. You can skip questions, you can go back to questions, but you're in module 1 for those 35 minutes. You cannot move ahead to module 2 or go back to reading and writing. Then once the 35 minutes are up, you move on to module 2, and you have 35 minutes to complete 22 more questions. So total 2 hours and 14 minutes and 98 questions. So now we're going to talk about the computer adaptive element of the digital SAT. And we saw sort of a preview of that with our last slide where we're talking about the modules, but let's talk about computer adaptive testing generally. So what is a computer adaptive test? A computer adaptive test adapts to your level as you take the test. So essentially your performance on an earlier part of the test determines the level of difficulty of the questions that you see later on the test. The advantage to this kind of test is it allows test makers to create much shorter assessments that are still very accurate. This is why the digital SAT is so much shorter because of the computer adaptive element. So let's talk about how this actually works on the digital SAT. The digital SAT is a section adaptive test. It's not a question adaptive test. So basically, digital SAT this is the technical name for it. It's a multi-stage adaptive test in 2 stages. So in the first stage, that's module 1, all test takers begin with a broad distribution of easy, medium, and hard questions with a medium average question difficulty. The questions within that module are predetermined. They are not adjusted based on a test taker's response. So that's why you can move around freely to any question within a module during your allotted time. The test taker's performance on module 1 determines the level of difficulty of module 2, which will either have a higher or lower average question difficulty than module 1. So once again, the questions within module 2 are predetermined. So once you're in module 2, they don't change and you can move around the module. Now, I've done this webinar a few times and I always get the question right about now, how does this work with scoring? What's the advantage of getting in the harder module 2 if you're just going to be essentially punished with more difficult questions? Well, the answer is a bit technical, and I'm going to try to answer it without getting too technical, but the digital SAT relies on something called item response theory, or IRT. This is generally how adaptive tests work. They rely on this thing called item response theory. Now, I'm not a psychometrician, but here's my understanding of how this works. IRT provides a framework for analyzing and modeling the relationship between an individual's ability level and their performance on a given test question. So it assumes that the probability that a test taker correctly answers a given question is a function of both their ability level and the difficulty level of that question. So what does that mean? Well, if you turn it around, think about this. So if you get a question right on a test, that's some evidence that you understand the material, right? Especially if it's a hard question. So what does this all mean in practical terms for scoring on the digital SAT? Questions on the digital SAT are assigned different weights based on their difficulty level. So a correct answer on a difficult question will increase a test taker's score more than a correct answer on an easy question. Therefore, students who perform well enough in Module 1 to take the harder Module 2 will have a higher potential score or higher score ceiling than students who take the easier Module 2, because students in the harder Module 2 will see a greater number of questions which are worth more points. So I hope that makes sense. You definitely, want to do the best you can, answer as many questions correctly as possible on Module 1, because you do want to get into that hard Module 2, which will give you the opportunity to answer the hardest questions. I do want to just once again highlight the point that the digital SAT is a section adaptive test, not a question adaptive test. And so you can, come back to questions. So it takes your performance on Module 1 as a whole into consideration, not, your performance question by question. Okay, so let's discuss a few test day logistics. So the digital SAT is taken in the BLUEBOOK app, which is College Board's proprietary testing application. And you have a number of tools and features that you can use as you take the test. There's a timer. You can see how much time is left on the current module. You'll get an alert when there are 5 minutes left. You can eliminate answer choices that you think are wrong. You can flag questions that you would like to view later. And then there's a question menu, so you can see which questions you've skipped or flagged for review. And then you can jump to any question in the module using the question menu. In the reading and writing section, you can highlight and annotate text. In the math section, you'll have access to a formula sheet that you can pull up. And in the math section, you'll also have access to a built-in graphing calculator by Desmos. It's the Desmos calculator, and we'll talk more about calculators in a moment. So you can use a variety of different devices for the SAT. You can use a personal laptop, a personal iPad, a school-owned desktop, a school-owned laptop. You can use a school-managed Chromebook. I would just say, be sure to check College Board's website to make sure that you have an approved device with the right system requirements before test day. So they have everything listed on their website. Just make sure that your device is permitted and compatible with the application ahead of time. Now, what happens if a student doesn't have access to one of these approved devices? College Board will allow students who don't have access to one of these devices to borrow a device. So they have a program in place for students who don't have an approved device. This is available for students both in the USA and international students. Any student basically who's taking the test on a standard weekend test date. Devices will be shipped directly to test centers for use on test day, which means that if you need to borrow a device, you need to arrive 30 minutes early. You can request a device you must actually request your device during the registration process, and you must complete this request at least 30 days in advance. So if you don't have access to an approved device, you need to borrow one from the College Board, make sure that you plan ahead, register early, and get your request in on time. This allows them time to actually ship the device and arrange logistics on their end. Calculators. So you can use a calculator on the entire math section of the digital SAT. So you can either use the built-in graphing calculator. So that's the Desmos graphing calculator. It's a great calculator. It can do a lot of things, and I highly recommend that everyone check it out. You can also bring an approved calculator. This is a great option if you have a calculator that you're comfortable with. Maybe you have one you've been using in math class and science class for the past few years. Just make sure that it's on the approved calculators list. Most graphing and scientific calculators are permitted. Four-function calculators are also permitted, although they're not really recommended because they don't really do enough to be that useful. The Desmos calculator is much better than those. You cannot bring calculators that connect to the internet, make noise, print on paper, or need to be plugged in. So once again, if you plan on bringing a calculator, make sure you double check that it's on the approved calculators list. And I will say this, even if you do plan on bringing your own calculator, I still recommend getting comfortable with Desmos, just in case something happens. As I said, it's a great calculator, but you don't want to, find yourself struggling to learn a new interface during the test because your calculator ran out of batteries, or you left your calculator at home, or something happened, got caught in a rainstorm and now it doesn't work, something like that. You just have a contingency plan, and, things happen. So Desmos is an excellent contingency. So just, as you're doing, even if you plan on using the calculator you're really familiar with and comfortable with, which I definitely encourage, just familiarize yourself a little bit with Desmos ahead of time, just in case something happens. So accommodations. So College Board will continue to support the same range of accommodations that are currently available on the paper SAT. But some of these accommodations will be administered differently on the digital test. For example, if you are a student who needed a large print test in the past, there's a zoom-in feature that you can use on the digital test. There's also a new linear, non-adaptive paper version of the test for students with relevant accommodations. And if you do need to request accommodations, know that the process for requesting them isn't changing. Accommodations must be approved before registration. And this process can take up to 7 weeks. So it's really important that you plan ahead. If you need an accommodation, know that you need to get that accommodation approved before you register, and the approval process can take up to 7 weeks. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, doing a more in-depth look at the test itself and the content covered on each section. So let's start with the reading and writing section. So as we've discussed, the reading and writing section has 2 modules. They're each 27 questions, 32 minutes long, and you get a section score between 200 and 800. Each question has its own short passage or pair of short passages. We'll see what this looks like in a second. And the modules are organized by question types. So questions testing similar skills will be grouped together. So this is what this looks like. So each question has its own short passage or pair of passages. So the passages are about 25 to 150 words. That's 150 to 900 characters. And they deal with a wide range of topics, including literary excerpts, and poetry. Poetry was not something we saw on the paper SAT. Some passages also contain informational tables and graphs. So as you can see here, here's an example of a question where you have a short passage and then it's asking you to, asking which word most logically completes the passage. So there are 4 broad, they're called content domains, which have different types of questions in them. We just saw an example of a words and context question. So this is under the craft and structure content domain. That's about 28% of the test. You'll see about 13 to 15 questions overall in this content domain. So that includes things like, as we just saw, a words and context question, questions about text structure and purpose, and cross-text connections. Then you'll have, about 26% of the test, that's 12 to 14 questions on information and ideas. So you'll see central ideas and details, command of evidence, both textual and quantitative. Quantitative, that's where you're going to see some of those graphs and tables, and then questions that are asking you to infer things from the text, inferences. You can see this sample question here has 2 short passages. So that's what I mean by a pair of short passages. So they're both short. And this one's asking you to, discuss a difference between the 2 authors' views. Now, when I say that questions testing similar skills are grouped together, you're going to see all those words and context questions together. You're going to see all those text structure and purpose questions together and cross-text connections questions together within each module. So you'll see words and context questions in both modules, and they'll, be grouped together in both modules. So, within each module, the questions are grouped by a scale or question type. Okay, so the remaining areas covered on the reading and writing section, you'll see standard English conventions. That's essentially grammar. That's about 26% of the test, or 11 to 15 questions overall. Things like boundaries, form, structure, and sense. And then finally, expression of ideas. That's about 20% of the test, or 8 to 12 questions overall. Questions like rhetorical synthesis. This is an example of that kind of question, where it's asking you to draw a conclusion from those different points, and then transitions, transitions between sentences, paragraphs, ideas, etc. Okay, let's talk a bit about a few strategies for the reading and writing section. So the most important rule of reading comprehension in general is that the passage will always provide all of the information needed to answer the question. So if any part of an answer choice doesn't match the information given in the passage, it's not correct. So in short, you need to find evidence for the answer choices in the passage. If you can't find evidence for that answer choice in the passage, it's not going to be the correct answer. Even if it references something that's true from outside the passage, you need to really focus on finding the evidence in the passage itself. One of the most, I think, valuable strategies for the reading and writing section is to think of your own answer choice before reading the answer choices. Now, a lot of these answer choices are designed to look plausible, but they're wrong. And it's really easy to find yourself in a situation where if you're looking at the answer choices first, you're saying, well, it could be A, it could be B, it could be C, it could be D, and you haven't eliminated anything. So it can be really helpful. So before reading those answer choices, think, how would I answer this question? If I had to write a sentence or something about it. And then if you have a clear idea of what you're looking for in the answer, it becomes much easier to evaluate the answer choices, so you don't fall into any of the traps. If you do need help narrowing things down, a helpful tip is, in general, you want to avoid answer choices that are too extreme. meaning if you see answer choices with words like only, always, never, other extreme words, these are unlikely to be the correct answer. You should also avoid answer choices that are too specific or that are too broad. These are also unlikely to be the correct answer. So make sure the scope of the answer choice matches the scope of the question and the scope of the passage. So these things, really extreme words, things that are really specific or really broad or general are red flags. So keep a lookout for those, as those answer choices tend to be wrong. Okay, so let's talk about the math section now. Once again, the math section has 2 modules, 22 questions each and 35 minutes long each. It's the same drill with the scoring. It's between 200 and 800 points to get your math section score. And unlike reading and writing, where all the questions are multiple choice, you have about 75% of the questions on the math section are multiple choice, and 25% are what's called student-produced response questions. If you're familiar with the paper version of the SAT, they had grid-in questions where you had to bubble in your answer choice. This is the digital version of those grid-in questions. So you have to come up with your own answer choice, or sorry, come up with your own answer. You aren't given 4 answer choices to choose from. Questions within each module are arranged in order of increasing difficulty. So you'll see easier questions towards the beginning of the module and harder questions towards the end of the module. So what content is covered on the digital SAT math? About 35% of the test, so 13 to 14 questions overall across both modules, will deal with algebra. So algebra includes things like linear equations in 1 variable, linear equations in 2 variables, linear functions, systems of 2 linear equations in 2 variables, and linear inequalities in 1 or 2 variables. Another 35% of the test is advanced math. So that's another 13 to 15 questions. And advanced math will cover things like equivalent expressions, nonlinear expressions in 1 variable and systems of equations in 2 variables, and nonlinear functions, such as quadratic, polynomial, exponential, absolute value, rational, radical functions, etc. Then about 15% of the test deals with problem solving and data analysis. It's about 5 to 7 questions. Problem solving and data analysis can cover topics such as ratios, rates, proportional relationships, and units, percentages, 1 variable data, talking about distributions and measures of both center and spread, 2 variable data, so models and scatter plots, probability and conditional probability, inference from sample statistics and margin of error, evaluating statistical claims, including observational studies and experiments. So the sample question you can see here is an example of a student-produced response question. So instead of those 4 answer choices, you have a box where you need to enter your own answer. Finally, the remaining 15%, that's another 5 to 7 questions, deals with geometry and trigonometry. So those topics include things like area and volume, lines, angles, and triangles, right triangles and trigonometry, and circles. Okay, so some tips for the math section. You really want to make sure you read the question carefully. This is a long test, and it's really easy to make a mistake because you're working quickly or you're tired, and then you read the question incorrectly because at the end of the test, you've been working quickly, you've done a lot of math, you've already done the reading and writing section, so you're tired, and it's just really easy to make a mistake that way. So make sure you're reading the questions carefully. It can be really helpful to pay attention to units where applicable, because that can sometimes be a clue to solving the problem. That's a general tip that works well, not just on the SAT, but for math and things like chemistry and physics tests generally. Always pay attention to the units. And then after solving, you want to check that you actually answer the question. So reread the question, make sure that you've actually answered what this question is asking you to do. So just double check yourself there. You definitely want to use your scratch paper. So sometimes it can be really helpful to draw pictures, but you definitely want to write your work down. Not because you're going to have to show it to anyone or prove that, if A is the correct answer, all you need to do is select A. You don't need to show what you did to get to A, but it does help your own mind stay organized. And if it's really exhausting if you try to do all the work in your head or in the calculator. It's much easier to keep yourself organized, reduce sort of the cognitive burden you're placing on yourself for this test by writing down your work. So use your scratch paper, write your work down. It'll make things easier for you. Okay, now a couple strategies to keep in mind. So for some questions, remember that the jumping off point is in the answers. So it can be helpful to work backwards. For example, like this question here, there's an unknown quantity, X, and it's asking you basically, what is X? So you can start by substituting the answer choices for the unknown quantity to see which is correct. It can be helpful to start with, one of the middle answer choices, either B or C here, because then you might be able to see, okay, I need a larger or smaller number. So that minimizes the number of answer choices you have to substitute and saves a little time. For other questions, you might find questions that seem really challenging to solve abstractly, particularly with limited time. So in cases like these, sometimes you can pick a number and plug them in. So use actual numbers to determine the answer. Pick values, substitute them if it makes sense in the context of the problem. So usually those are problems where you see variables in the question and variables in the answer choices. Okay, so let's chat a little bit about how to prepare for this test. So preparation allows students to gain familiarity with the test, which helps them build confidence and decrease test-related anxiety. So let's jump into how to actually prepare for tests like the SAT. These same principles work for, it's not just the SAT, but for tests generally. So this is what we recommend. This is what we found works really well for students. First thing you're going to do, take a full-length practice test. Then review the results, then do targeted practice, and then you'll repeat the whole process. So let's break that down. Step 1, take a full-length practice test. This will help you gain familiarity with the test's style, difficulty, and content so that you know what to expect. When you're practicing for the digital SAT, you should make sure the practice tests you're using are both digital and adaptive. They should also be full-length tests that are timed. So you really want to get used to what it feels like to take this computer adaptive test. Step 2, review the results. The review process is possibly the most important step of your test prep. This is the place where you're going to learn the most. So this is where you want to identify the areas that need the most improvement. So go back through the test and review every question that you answered incorrectly or that you skipped. You should also, I should add, review questions that you answered correctly, but you happened to guess on. Maybe you flagged them because you weren't quite sure about them. Review those questions as well. So you want to look at those questions again, read the answer explanations, make sure you understand how to do that question if you were to see something similar again. Then, learn some test taking strategies, try to understand how you could have arrived at the correct answer and how you could have avoided choosing the answer that you chose. And also make note of any concepts you need to review. Then you're going to do targeted practice. So you want to focus on those areas that you identified in the previous step. So practice specific question types until you're confident that you understand, what those questions are asking and how to do them. And you want to review relevant content as well. So on any test, mastery of content is critical. I think it's especially important on an adaptive test because you really want to make sure that you're solid on all of the content so you can really maximize your opportunities to get into the difficult module 2, so that you can have the opportunity to answer those hard questions. So for example, why content is super critical here. Let's say you have a student who's a really strong reader, but needs some work on things like vocabulary and grammar. So they may, if they're missing a lot of, the standard English convention questions, may not do well enough in Module 1 to get into Module 2 hard. But let's say they're really great at the reading questions and they always get the hard reading questions right. They're just weak in some of the areas. If you shore up, the ability to answer those questions, the standard English convention questions in this case, so that they really can, feel comfortable that on those, that can help them get into Module 2 hard, where they're going to have those, difficult reading questions and have the opportunity to answer those correctly, which the student tends to do, this hypothetical student, so that they can really realize their full potential. They're not limiting themselves by missing too many questions in Module 1. Similarly, let's say it's been a while since you've taken geometry and you need some geometry content review. It's very common. A lot of students need at least some review on something or other when they're preparing for the SAT. But let's say you can't remember any geometry. Geometry is about 15% of the math test, math section. So that's 15% of the questions that you aren't confident, you don't really know how to do anymore because it's been a while since you've taken geometry. You're effectively placing a ceiling on your own score. So review the geometry so that you feel more confident with it. Then there suddenly haven't been essentially 15% of the questions that have been taken off the table. Now you have, a fighting chance of answering all those questions correctly. So content is key on the SAT. Everyone needs some content review. Identify what you need to review and then spend some time working on it in between practice tests. So once you've spent some time reviewing the concepts you need to review, the skills you need to review, practicing those question types that you missed before, then you want to repeat the process. So take another full-length practice test, review those results, and do more targeted practice. And then again, take another full-length practice test, review those results, and do more targeted practice. So we found, it is helpful for students to space out their preparation. I would say you don't want to do more than one practice test a week or every other week to give yourself enough time to really do the targeted practice. It's helpful to really, space those out into shorter practice sessions rather than trying to, cram it into a few long sessions. Your brain, in general, students seem to absorb information better if they do, a little bit each day and space that out rather than trying to, cram everything into one long, steady session. Okay, so we're talking about, frequency of practice tests, when to start preparing. Let's look at some good, steady timelines. So just want to say before we get into this, there's no one size fits all. It's a lot of people have a, wide range of time in which they can take the SATs. So people start at different times. There's no, one perfect answer, but this is sort of generally what we recommend. So I usually recommend that students who have completed Algebra 2 start preparing for the SAT in the spring of their sophomore year or the summer after. So once you've completed Algebra 2, if you took it as a sophomore, either the late spring of your sophomore year or the summer after is a great time to start preparing. Then if you do that, you'll be ready to take the test for the first time in the fall or the spring of your junior year. That gives you plenty of time to take the test again. One advantage is if you're taking a lot of AP classes as a junior, this is a great timeline because you can take the test in the fall or March, and that lets you fully concentrate on your AP exams in April and May. So this year's a little different with the transition to the digital test. So if you're, let's say you're in the class of 2025, so you're rising junior, you've taken Algebra 2, and you feel ready and just want to get the test out of the way in the fall, by all means, do so. You'd be taking the paper test. Just know that if you decide you want to take the test again after December, you'll be taking the digital test. And if, let's say you want to do some PSAT prep because maybe you're in the range where you might qualify for national merit, know that the PSAT will be digital. So if that's the situation you're in, you may be better off waiting to take the digital SAT in March, just so you don't have to prepare for two different tests. The content's basically the same, but it's a very different testing experience. So just as I said, there's no right or wrong answer here. Just keep that in mind as you're thinking about your preparation timeline. So either way, it's a great goal to have to finish your testing before your senior year so that you can focus on your applications. However, do know that taking the test in the fall of your senior year is also a viable option. So if you are, approaching your senior year now, don't panic. You can still take the test in the fall of your senior year. Here's another timeline. So many students begin preparing for the SAT in the fall of their junior year, and then are ready to take the test in the spring of their junior year for the first time. This is also a great timeline. It gives students plenty of time to take the test again, before senior year, so you can take it again a couple times in the summer. I think as we saw in the math section, the math section is pretty heavy on algebra and advanced math. So it is a good idea to wait to take the test until you've had a semester of Algebra 2. So if you're taking Algebra 2 as a junior, this timeline will probably help you be more successful in the test. Because remember, so combined algebra and advanced math, that's 70% of the test. Advanced math is 35% of the test. So a lot of that content is covered in Algebra 2. You don't want to, go into the test not yet comfortable with 35% of the content on the math section. You are better off waiting until you've had at least one semester of Algebra 2 in that case. So this timeline, again, still gives you time to take the test multiple times before your senior year. I do want to note that there may be additional factors in a student's academic or personal life that impact this preparation timeline. So remember, these are general guidelines and principles in test preparation, and every student and situation is different. There is more than one path to success. So if you don't fall into these timelines, don't worry, don't panic. As I said, there's more than one path to success. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. These are just guidelines and suggestions. Okay, finally, let's talk a little bit about the ACT. So colleges accept both the SAT and the ACT in general. I actually can't think of a single college that isn't, so there are test blind schools, obviously, but if a school accepts the SAT, they're generally going to accept the ACT. Doesn't mean there aren't exceptions to that. I just can't think of any off the top of my head. So really, you do have the choice. How do you decide which test to take? They're both great tests. So there's really, again, no right or wrong answer here. It's really a matter of personal preference. So how do you determine? Best way to determine which one you prefer is to try them both. So take a full-length practice test for each test. And first, see which one goes better. Did one go much better? Were they pretty much the same? See if there's one you really, really preferred. There are some things you should consider about each test. The timing's a little different. The digital SAT is shorter than the ACT. So that could be a factor. I wouldn't necessarily let that make your decision for you. There's the test modality. So do you prefer a paper test or do you prefer a digital test? So the ACT does have a digital option, and it's currently offered internationally and during school day testing. It's the same as the paper test, it's just on a computer. ACT did recently announce that they're going to make this option more widely available, I believe starting this December and sort of slowly expanding from there. So students in the future will have the option to take a digital ACT or a paper ACT. They will continue to support the paper test. So if you really prefer a paper test, definitely look at the ACT. Reading passage length is certainly also something to consider. The ACT has long passages. The SAT has short passages. This also comes down to a matter of personal preference. Some students may, in fact, prefer the long passages to the short passages. So see which one you prefer. See which test is easier for you. The SAT has these student-produced responses. ACT is all multiple choice. So if you prefer all multiple choice, ACT may be the way for you. SAT has some math formulas provided. ACT does not have those provided. And the ACT has a science section, which the SAT does not. Now, I just want to note about the science section. It's not a section that's testing your mastery of, particular scientific facts. For example, you don't have to be an expert in chemistry or biology or geology or astronomy or physics in order to ace the science section. It's actually more like a reading comprehension section, just dealing with scientific topics, inferences, there's some graphs. So if you're a strong reading student, but maybe don't feel like you're the strongest in science class, I wouldn't be intimidated by this. It actually could be a section where you could really, really shine because it is so much like reading comprehension. So definitely, I think the ACT is also a great test. Definitely encourage everyone to check that out as well. Okay, so I see we have a few questions. Let me pull those up. And let me see, I'm just going to take a look here and see where we should start. Okay, so I see two questions that they don't appear on the surface similar, but they kind of have the same answer. So I'm going to answer those together. So number one, is the digital SAT easier or harder than the paper SAT? And if I take both the paper and digital SAT, can I super score? Okay, so College Board has conducted a number of studies to essentially equate the two tests. So to make them so that you can so that schools can use the digital SAT and the paper SAT side by side as an equivalent metric. So they did a lot of, statistical studies about the tests. So, if you get, let's say, an 1160 on the paper SAT, that's statistically equivalent to an 1160 on the digital SAT. If you get a 1250 on the digital SAT, that's statistically equivalent to getting what did I just say? No, I can't remember. Was it 1250? It's the same score. Their scores are statistically equivalent from the paper to the digital SAT. So you may find that you as an individual have a preference for one test over the other. So if you're a rising junior class of 2025 in the USA, Puerto Rico, US Virgin Islands, then you do have that window where you can, either take the paper test before December or wait to take the digital test. So you may wish to see if you have a strong preference for one over the other, but statistically speaking, a score on one is the same as on the other, so they're equivalent. So one's not easier or harder than the other, if that makes sense. So, and that also feeds into, if I take both the paper and digital SAT, can I superscore? Essentially, College Board is saying that these are equivalent tests. As I said, an 1160 on the digital is equivalent to an 1160 on the paper. So College Board is saying, yes, you should be able to superscore them. So let me actually take a step back and explain what superscoring is. So superscoring is a practice where, let's say you take the SAT multiple times. Let's say you take it twice, right? You take the highest math score and the highest reading and writing score from those two tests, and you put them together. So let's say on your first test, you got a 600 on the reading and writing and an 800 on the math. And then on the next test, you got an 800 on the reading and writing and a 750 on the math. What a super score would do would be to let you take both 800s and get a 1600. So College Board is saying you should be able to do this on the digital SAT. However, super scoring itself is not like an official thing you do through the College Board. It's something that a school will either allow you to do or not allow you to do on their application. So ultimately, it comes down to what a particular school decides. So some colleges may allow you to superscore, some colleges might not allow you to superscore. So basically, you're going to want to check with the institutions you're applying to see if they'll allow you to do that. Okay, here's a question about the ACT. Do you think the ACT will also become digital/computer adaptive? So ACT recently announced that they will be expanding their computer-based test options, so their digital test option to more students. So students who are taking the ACT on a standard weekend test date will begin to have access to that computer-based version of the test. However, it's not an adaptive test. So there's adaptive tests and there are linear tests. So the questions don't change. It's what's called a linear test. It's basically the same as the paper test, it's just on a computer. So they will, starting in, I believe, December, they're starting with a more limited pilot, but they are generally planning on expanding that to more students. They will make more computer-based testing options available, but they will continue to support the paper test, and their digital test is not computer adaptive. Okay, next question here. Some of these we answered over the course of the webinar. Okay, here's one. If you skip a question and go back at the end of the module, do the questions change? So no, the questions don't change. So when you start a module, at the start of the module, all the questions are fixed. So you can move around, you can skip questions. The questions aren't going to change. They're not going to get easier or harder because you answered other questions correctly in the rest of the module. Those questions will remain the same. The adaptive part of the SAT happens when you move from, module 1 to module 2. So which module 2 you get is the adaptive part, either the easier or the harder module 2. But once you're in a module, the questions stay the same. Okay. And I think we answered the rest of these already. But I will say, if you have any more questions for us, please feel free to reach out to us. You can email us at support@testinnovators.com or give us a call at 1-800-280-1857. We'd be happy to answer any of your questions. If you're an educator and want to learn more about the tools we have for educators, please also reach out to us, and we'll connect you with our team. You can also email the schools team directly at sales@testinnovators.com. You can also visit our website if you'd like to check out our materials at testinnovators.com/SAT. We do have an adaptive sample test, so you can try out the different question types, see how the different modules work with the free sample test. And then we also have practice tests, full-length visual SAT practice tests. We have 6 of those. We have 1 digital PSAT practice test, and then we have hundreds of practice exercises that you can use for targeted practice in between your practice tests. Thank you all so much for coming today. I hope you all have a wonderful day. And again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.